A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This is Abu Hadi, Migration 313. Welcome to the second part of our series, The Revealer, the Messenger, and the Message, based on the book by Allama Shaheed Muhammad Baqir As-Sadr. This is a continuation of part one, so if you haven't watched the first part, I suggest that you watch it before watching the second part so you'll get more out of it. So, if God exists, then what is our obligation towards God? So this is the question. So we established in the first part, based on the proof that God exists. Now, what is our, as human beings, obligation? How do we find out what this obligation is? How do we establish a relationship with our Creator? The first step in creating any relationship, as we all know, is communication. There needs to be an open line of communication between us and our Creator. So how do we establish this? In Islam, as well as most other religions, God communicates to people through messengers called prophets, people who God chooses to deliver His message to the world or to other smaller communities. People communicate to God through prayer and supplication. This is the same in Islam as it is in basically all other religions. The difference is all religions have their prophets, the people that they say are the ones who gave the revelation from God to man, and the messages of all these prophets are different. So our question is, how do we establish who is a real prophet? There are hundreds of religions with thousands of prophets, all claiming to be carrying a message from God. If we want to establish a relationship with God through His messenger, through communication, and we want to know what He is communicating to us through His messenger, how do we do that? There's so many people that claim that they're a prophet. They don't agree with each other. There's contradictions between them. Some prophets say God said you can marry more than one woman. Some prophets say you can't. There's some people that say our prophet says we can drink alcohol. There's other people that say our prophet says we can't. There's some people that say our prophet says that we can, smoke marijuana, as with, the Rastafarians. And some other religions say you can't. So if we want to know how to establish a relationship with God and how to get the message through the messenger, through His channel that He's approved, how do we establish which of all the messengers, which one is from God? So we can again use the inductive process, like we did in the first part, to prove that a messenger is from God. So let's revisit the idea of the letter. If a man receives a letter from one of his relatives who is a small child in an elementary school, yet this letter contains eloquent, advanced language, advanced scientific theories, etc., then we would have to conclude that this letter is not from the child, and that this letter is in fact from an adult, or from someone who knows about science, who is eloquent, who has advanced knowledge and advanced learning. Another analogy, if you walk outside in the middle of the night and see the entire sky lit up, and at the same time there's a lamp on your porch, you know that this lamp is not sufficient to creating the light. So a small lamp cannot light up the whole sky. There must be some greater source of light that is lighting the sky, like lightning, like other things. It is self-evident that something which is weak cannot produce that which is great. A person with very little knowledge cannot produce a significant work of science or philosophy. This is self-evident, meaning that everybody knows this. If you can't, the source has to be greater than what's derived from it, or at least equal. If things happen, if you see a large something, or you see something great or something large, it points to a source that is much greater or larger than the thing that you're seeing. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born in the 6th century AD in the Arabian Peninsula, one of the most backward areas on earth at the time. This area was not known for its literature or its philosophy, such as the Greek area, and it was not known for its great works of technology or writing, such as the area of Mesopotamia. The area of Mesopotamia and Iraq was different than the area of the Arabian Peninsula. In these areas, although there was some communication, they were extremely different. The Arabs of that time basically lived in the desert, in tents. And they had no culture, they had no civilization, they had no cities, major cities, they had no any kind of huge literary accomplishment to point at. They worshipped statues made of stone and wood and regarded their tribe above all other things. They regarded women simply as property to be bought, sold, traded, or disposed of as they wished. They were constantly engaged in tribal feuds and wars that lasted generations. The knowledge that they had access to mainly consisted of oral history, legends, and some poetry, and even this was very scarce. This is the environment that the Prophet Muhammad was born into. He had no ability to read or write. He had no access to the great libraries, or he had no access to even in the area, there were some Christians in the area in Najran, but the tribes of Arabia, the Arab tribes, had very, very little communication with them or any other groups of people. So you would not expect, nor is it possible, for a human being born into such an environment to produce a work such as the Holy Quran. The Holy Quran contains information on many scientific facts that have only been discovered in the last 50 to 100 years. And if you think that it's possible, then how is it possible for the Quran to contain facts regarding many different scientific fields such as astronomy, biology, hydrology, geology, at the same time put this information in a work that is easy to listen to and memorize, and does not belong to any existing form of literature, either poetry or prose? And the Quran is only one component of the events surrounding the advent of Islam. So in order for someone to say that the revelation came from a man, the list of coincidences or random events to come together at the same time at the same place would be so huge that you could come to a point where it is impossible for this to occur. So we'll talk a little bit about the Holy Quran here, because there may be some people listening to this who are not familiar with, who are not familiar with the Holy Quran. So basically the Holy Quran is a work in Arabic. And most people have heard about it, but a lot of people don't know what it contains. It's a work, it is neither poetry or prose, so that none of the existing styles that were around at the time of the revelation actually fit the Quran. So it's not poetry, it's not prose, it's not a work, it's not a science textbook, it's not an economics textbook, but it contains information about all of these fields, and it ties it all together in a very eloquent and a very, you could say, way that's easy to read and it's easy to memorize, and it sounds very nice. And when some people hear it, they comment, "Oh, it's beautiful sounding," so they think, well, the Quran must be some work of poetry like Shakespeare or Byron or whatever. But the difference is that Shakespeare and those types of things, and most poets and those things, they make poetry that it sounds nice when you hear it, but if you listen to it, or if you look at the words and you look at the meanings, most of it is nonsense. It's just basically words strung together to sound nice, to elicit an emotional reaction out of people. And it's not, the value of it is not really too much, except for the fact that it entertains people and it makes them feel good for a limited amount of time. The Holy Quran is different than this. The Holy Quran, although it has that aspect of it, it also contains many facts, such as the fact that the Earth moves on plates, the theory of tectonics, which has only been discovered in the last 50 or 60 or maybe 100 years. This is mentioned in the Holy Quran. Facts about embryology, how the fetus develops in the womb of the mother. And it's accurate. It's very accurate, by the way. And of course, in the 6th century, there was no ultrasounds. There was no way at that time for anybody to actually know the different stages and how the fetus develops in the womb from the zygotic stage to the fetal stage and finally to birth. There was absolutely no way that anybody could have known it. They could see if a woman died during pregnancy or she died when they were small, they can see different stages of clot or other things, but they couldn't see the stages and how they're connected and those things. There's absolutely no way. The Quran talks about how the seas are divided. One sea flows into another sea, yet they're not mixed, because one is more and one has a slightly different salt content than the other. We know that now. Of course, oceanographers know that, but at the time, if you were to go into the Arabian Peninsula or anywhere else in the world or anywhere around it where the Atlantic and the Pacific meet, in Panama, or you were to go to the different places on Earth where the oceans meet, you would just see one ocean and you would have absolutely no idea. And the Arabs at that time couldn't measure salinity or anything like that, so they would have no idea. Yet the Quran talks about that. The Quran talks about the Big Bang, how the heavens and the earth were joined together, and then God's, exploded them, and this is talked about in the Holy Quran, and how the water cycle works. And there's many other facts and many other scientific facts, and I invite the people who don't know about this to just simply do a Google search, the Quran embryology, the Quran hydrology, the Quran biology, the Quran, any kind of different subjects that you want, and you will see that it talks about many of these things. And non-Muslims, by the way, don't dispute that it talks about these things, by the way, accurately. And by the way, they have no explanation for that, except to say that the Quran came from a man. And we've proved, basically by induction, that it doesn't come from a man. So we must come to the conclusion, the inevitable conclusion, based on these facts, that the religion of Islam and the Holy Quran, which is part of that religion, comes from a source that is much more profound and much more powerful than human being collectively. Because I want you to think about this for a second before we come to the conclusion. That the Prophet Muhammad was a man. Prophet Muhammad was a man. And Muslims and non-Muslims, everybody agree on that. He was born into a certain environment. Like I said, the environment that he had no access to any books or literature or anything. You could say that the most that he could possibly accomplish on his own is what we'll say, many other people throughout history or works of literature, if he was very creative and extremely and a genius and profound in all this, he could maybe come up with something like what Shakespeare came up with, or what Charles Dickens came up with, or another, work of literature, or something like that. That is the absolute maximum that he could possibly do on his own. But when you look at something like the Holy Quran and you look at the Hadith, and not only the Hadith, but you look at that he was not only, he didn't sit in his house and write all day like Shakespeare and other things. He actually fought battles, and he ran a government, and he raised children, and he was engaged in a lot of religious activities, and he was engaged in politics at the end of his life, and all of these things. So he didn't just sit in his house and write all day, and yet he came up with a work, the Holy Quran, which is unique in literature, and it's unique as far as works of the time. And not only did he did the Holy Quran, something like that, he came up with the Holy Quran, but he, like I said, at the same time, he also ran a government, he also raised a family, he also fought battles, many battles, by the way. He also engaged in political activity. He also was overseeing the economy of Medina at the time, and the Medina at the time was actually like a state, and he was also the religious leader. Okay, so you have to look at things like this and think, and people say, he was just a man, but a man does not have the ability to do these kind of things. A man, if he wants to be a great warrior, then he would just fight battles and that's it. A man, if he wanted to be a successful politician and establish a government and run a state, then that's all he would do. A man, if he wanted to become a great writer or a great poet, would sit around and write and do poetry, and that's it. That's the maximum that somebody can accomplish. But for somebody to do all of these things and to do them in a way that still is a model for people and echoes throughout the centuries, you would say that there's absolutely no way that this could come from a man. And this is the proof. So, like I said, there's many other people that claim to be prophets, but if you can point to any one of those other prophets who did what the Prophet Muhammad did, peace be upon him, and who had the revelation that he had, then I would say that we have a contender for being a prophet of God. But if they can't produce those things, if they can't produce the proofs, then they're not a messenger of God. And so we could say that the source of the message, the messenger of Islam, who is Prophet Muhammad, the source of the revelation and the source of this is God Almighty, and he was not merely a human being. And going back to the original question that we began with, what is our obligation towards God? The obligation is this, and it's something that's very obvious. It doesn't require that much explanation. It's that, number one, if we know that God exists, and number two, if we know that he sends messengers to us, then our obligation is that when a messenger comes to us from God, and we can establish for sure that this is a messenger from God, that we obey this messenger and that we follow him, and that by doing this, in fact, we're following God. And the word Islam, that's exactly what it means. It means submission to the will of God through following his messengers. And that's exactly what the phrase means. So we'll conclude on this point, and then in the next video, we're going to go over part 3, which is the message. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.